It is my opportunity today to talk to Beth Osborne. Beth is a vice president for technical assistance at Transportation for America. And we're going to talk about a paper that she just published that basically is offering recommendations to the next president on how to bring America's transportation system into the 21st century so it serves everyone and not just more than a handful of people, but serves a wider audience more efficiently and effectively, and hopefully with a less environmental impact. So, Beth, welcome to EV World.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, let's begin here. First of all, let's talk about, so if you would summarize this paper, a new principle for our transportation program.
Absolutely. I was approached by the Bernard Schwartz Institute with the Century Foundation to write this, and the notion was we get a lot of conversation about how the transportation program needs more funding, but we don't talk as much about what we should expect to get out of that system. And so if you read the report, you'll notice that we do talk about funding needs and the need to invest in the program and how we might do this, but it's listed last. And that is because there's a lot that we could do with the money we are currently raising to get a greater bang for our buck. And so the majority of the paper is spent on suggesting that we could prioritize funding better, we could encourage a focus on fixing what we've built before building massive new infrastructure that we cannot maintain, that we support innovation and by using competitive programs rather than traditional revenue sharing programs whereby states get money whether they're performing well or poorly.
Right.
And that we also look to coordinate better between development decisions in transportation systems and all the things that can impact the transportation system, which interestingly means we need to bring the program closer to the local level. Most development decisions are made at the local level, and if we insist on making all the decisions at the state level, we can't properly coordinate with development decisions, and that's why you build something and then something crops up near that building and it interferes with what you've built. We like to pretend in transportation that was unexpected. It's not unexpected. It should be completely expected. And if we were doing our job right, we would be pulling those people into the same room and figuring this out at the front end. So we were building better from the start and anticipating what will obviously come.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about your background. What sort of interested you in talking about infrastructure, highways, bridges, interchanges, all those kinds of things that, railroads and airports and the whole thing. What sort of attracted you to this?
Well, I've always loved the built environment. When I was a little kid, my mother and I would lay out strips of masking tape to lay out roads on the floor, and we build up little communities around it. And I will tell you, I always built gridded roads. I never once built a cul-de-sac. And that was starting at 5 years old. So I was already thinking about these issues then.
Yeah.
But it was also very personal when I grew up in New Orleans, and I went to college and law school at Louisiana State University. And while in law school in particular, I didn't have enough money to pay my bills, so I wanted to find a job. But I couldn't find a job that I could get to outside of a car. But I couldn't afford to buy a car because I couldn't get a job. And I grew up solidly middle class.
Yeah.
And that was a real eye-opener for me, that someone who grew up with as much means as I did still struggled to work my way into the economy. And it just, to me, it felt inefficient. It felt sloppy. And it just didn't make a lot of sense. Now, as it turned out, my parents could afford to get me a used car that then became my lifeline to the world.
Yeah.
But then when I moved to Washington, D.C., I, like most millennials today, decided where I wanted to live and then looked for a job.
Right.
I didn't move for a job.
Yeah.
I lived in D.C. for a good long time before I found that first job. But I lived here because I lived off of the proceeds of selling that car. And every time I considered buying a new one, I found other ways to spend my money that I felt were more either productive or just more fun.
Right.
I bought a condo before the market here went completely batty. And I mean, thank heavens, I never could get in now.
Right.
And I was then able to go from a condo to a townhouse. And frankly, I've been able to travel and go to Paris and go to Italy with what would have been my car payment, or save money for my kids' college accounts with what would have been my car payment. And so for me, the impact of the way the communities are laid out and the transportation system is structured has a very personal impact on me. And most recently, when my husband and I decided to buy a car again, it was because his employer, the FBI, moved from right in the middle of town out to the exurbs.
Yeah.
And I view that as an $8,000 a year pay cut.
Yeah.
And I take it personally. So I see how this impacts my life on a daily basis. And I know it impacts more people than just me. It impacts every one of us. But I don't think it's typical for people to focus on how the built environment impacts how you behave. And so I want to kind of demystify that and talk about it a little bit more, and then how our programs don't necessarily cooperate with what our end goals are.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit of history here. From the decisions that we've made regarding particularly our roads and our highways really stems largely from the Eisenhower administration and the desire to, essentially emulate what the troops found when they got to Germany and they found the Autobahn. They said, well, that's a great idea. Let's build that here. And so much of, I think, what we have done with respect to how our communities are laid out and how we interconnect our cities and things is all based sort of predicated on that. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. We often forget where the program came from. But you're absolutely right. Eisenhower was so taken with what he saw in Germany. He saw it as a strategic advantage to have a way to move military across the country. And I think when he was president or when he was campaigning, he tried to do a coast-to-coast trip, and it took something like 20 or 30 days.
Yeah.
And he realized that was a problem. What was interesting is when we discussed the laying out of the roadways, there was a belief that if the highways did not go smack dab through the center of cities, that the cities would be left behind. We then spent decades building beltways because it turned out building these things for the center of cities was a terrible idea.
Right.
Not just from what it did to the cities, but it didn't create the Autobahn expressway that we were seeking. It created a main street that got bogged down and created a mess in the middle of town.
Yeah.
And so we've now gone back and fixed that with beltways, sometimes multiple beltways around cities. And I think if we were to do it over again, we might just start by circumnavigating those cities rather than going through the center. But also, unfortunately, there was a bit of a racial component to it. Yeah. Highways were an excuse for urban renewal, which happened to go through minority neighborhoods, even beautiful minority neighborhoods like in my hometown of New Orleans. It went through the Tremaine neighborhood and destroyed it in spite of the fact that that was a beautiful middle to upper middle class African-American neighborhood.
Yeah, okay. All right, so what you're suggesting then are ways to begin to think differently, because up to this point, we think our planning departments just tend to think about, well, we just need more highways. And so that's where much of the funding that we get is coming from, for example, the gasoline tax. I think one of the points that you make in there is that once upon a time when this whole idea was conceived, there were sufficient funds and people were driving further, and there was always more money in the kitty for the Congress to spend either on real needed projects or on boondoggles. Pork barrel bridges to nowhere, and that's begun to change, so that basically we're seeing shortfalls now, and we're having to come up with, I think, as you described, a sort of phony funding, or gimmicky. Maybe the word is gimmicky funding things for these programs. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to call it phony. It's deficit spending, whether we want to call it that or not. For one thing, we're coming up with 10-year pay-fors that only cover 5 years, and in cases of some of the extensions, they were 10-year pay-fors for 10 months of expenditures. So, I mean, that's about as phony and gimmicky as you can possibly imagine. But I think you're absolutely right. The American people did us a favor from a budgetary perspective for a very long time, and they voluntarily, or so we like to pretend,
Right.
drove 2% more per year for decades. And back in the 1990s, when we raised the gas tax to 18.4 cents per gallon of gasoline, not only did we come up with a big chunk of money by raising the gasoline tax, but then with people driving further every single year, we were able to feel like we'd indexed that gas tax because we were getting more each year, year over year. And from a congressional perspective and from a bipartisanship perspective, there's nothing that's easier to be bipartisan over than dividing up an unexpected windfall of funding, which is what we've gotten to do for 20 years.
Yeah.
But starting in the early 2000s, the American people stopped cooperating with us. And we could have a long conversation about what that is. I think in another 10 years, we'll look back and be able to write a reasonably researched paper about why driving trailed off. On a per capita basis, it dipped by a great deal. On a regular basis, it's pretty flat. It's gone down a little bit. We're now basically coming up again when you include population growth into things. But on a per capita basis, driving is still pretty flat, which means we feel poor. In reality, we were always poor. In reality, we were always outspending our needs because all of the stuff we were building was going to have to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
But we were ignoring that, pretending that that bill would never come due, and building everything we wanted. And as long as more money was coming into the coffers every year, we could ignore the problem. Well, now we can't ignore the problem anymore because we've reached a day where tons of our infrastructure has to be rebuilt, but we still want to build new things. So let's tease that apart for a second. One is, how do we make sure we're maintaining what we have, period? And then the question is, if you're going to build new things, what should it be? So in terms of how do we maintain what we have? Well, you have to prioritize maintenance over building new things. And I know that's not a fun thing to say, but there's this belief that if we can just get that next increment of money, we'll have all the money we need. Well, here is the great secret that people don't realize yet. There will never be enough money ever, no matter how much we raise. If we had infinite dollars, we'd have infinite needs. If we doubled our program tomorrow, a lot of the projects we're working on would double in size overnight because all of a sudden we'd add bells and whistles to them and everyone would come out of the woodworks with more money. When I ran the Tiger program at the U.S. Department of Transportation and we had $1.5 billion, we thought, oh, if we only had three, we could do amazing things.
We could do with three,
Then we had 500 million, and it turned out you could do a lot with 500 million too. And we thought wistfully back to the days of 1.5. There will never be enough. There will never be a magical number. So we have to acknowledge that. We have to allow that to be a freeing concept, and recognize that we have to prioritize what we spend, and the top priority should be maintaining what we've built. And as we're maintaining it, we can improve it. Now, when I say improve it, it may not mean expand it. In transportation, when you say improve, you automatically mean
more
make it
lanes.
Yes. Even if population and driving is down in the region, we expand. And we should be, in many cases where populations have shifted, shrinking. And in many places, they don't want a big, wide open highway. They want something that is supportive. They don't want a lot of throughput. They want people to come to their community. And the roadway should support that being a place where people land and stop, not just constantly go speeding through.
I remember a good example that you bring up in the paper, I think, is Rochester.
Yes, and I was about to go to Rochester.
Where they had this, much like we have the same thing here in Omaha. We have this, Highway 4 or Interstate 480, plows right through the middle of town. You never have to stop. And Rochester apparently decided that, okay, and I think Detroit's even talking about doing that. Let's just get rid of that and let's or at least modify it so that we can begin to have something that's more locally oriented.
Yes. And we're seeing that in more and more cities where they're talking about at least ways to modify it and make it less obtrusive. The Sheridan Expressway in New York, they're talking about a similar thing. In New Haven, they have reclaimed the air rights over one of those very big interstates,
Right.
and they're developing over it, and they're shrinking it down. And a lot of it is very practical. In Rochester, they had some place, depending on which segment, 10 to 12 lanes, and they were empty.
Yeah.
They had about the traffic on it of a typical 3 to 4 lane local street in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And they were maintaining 12 lanes. It had come to the end of its useful life, and the question is, do we pay to rebuild this massive infrastructure nobody's using, or do we use this much less money to turn this back into a locally serving boulevard?
Yeah.
And because it just didn't have the traffic counts to justify it being such a gigantic expressway, they've decided to reclaim a lot of that territory and develop on it and turn it into an urban boulevard. I remember the former mayor who was really advocating for this project before he left. He said in the 1950s, the engineers came into Rochester and they said, we really need to widen these roadways and speed up traffic so people can get out of town in case of an emergency. And he said, that's just what they did. They evacuated my city. They never came back. I want to narrow those roads and slow down traffic so they get stuck here and they spend their money.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've got some of these different suggestions on how do we fund this thing, because I think if a Tea Party person came in here and were listening to this conversation, they'd probably say, oh, well, she's talking about spending less money and less tax dollars or doing more things more efficiently, which I think would resonate if they understood it. The logic here is that, like you said, if we had infinite amount of money, infinite tax dollars pouring in, if we gave all our money to the government, it would still never be enough.
Never be.